Before we begin today's presentation, here is a brief and unrelated word. Quite apart from today's subject, there is also a separate book series titled Psyop Christianity, written by Ron Allen Curtis Ratzlaff, under the pen name The Awakened Hybrid. It is its own, entirely different investigation. That work stands on its own. Across 7 volumes, it examines historical anomalies in the origins of Christianity and makes the evidence-driven case that the faith was shaped deliberately by the Roman Empire. If that separate subject interests you, the complete series is available now on Amazon. Simply search Psyop Christianity or scan the code on screen. Now, let us begin. The clock no one built and everyone obeys. Every date you have ever been taught, the fall of Rome in the 5th century, the coronation of Charlemagne in the year 800, the sailing of 3 ships toward a horizon in 1492 rests on a single, largely unexamined foundation. It is not a foundation of stone or bone or ash. It is a foundation of arithmetic, assembled by a small number of named men working in a specific century for reasons that had nothing to do with objective truth and everything to do with the survival of the institutions that employed them. This investigation exists to name those men, to show their arithmetic, and to ask the question that Western education has spent 4 centuries training its students never to ask out loud. Who built the clock? And why does everyone still set their watch by it without checking the mechanism? We are not going to ask you to burn your history books. We are going to ask you to read the fine print inside them. The fine print that the discipline of history itself, when it is being honest with its own practitioners, already admits. Because here is the uncomfortable truth this investigation opens with. The chronology taught in every Western classroom is not a discovery. It is a construction. It was built by a specific man in a specific century, working from incomplete and contradictory sources, funded by specific dynasties with specific financial interests in the outcome, and adopted not because it was independently verified against nature, but because it was useful to the churches, the banks, and the tax-collecting states of early modern Europe. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the documented biography of Joseph Justus Scaliger, and we are going to walk through it with the same forensic patience a jury would demand before returning a verdict. And once we have established that the clock itself was built, not found, we will turn to the man who spent 30 years of his life trying to prove exactly how far the clock had been wound wrong. A Russian topologist named Anatoly Fomenko, whose statistical methods for detecting duplicate history are the most mathematically rigorous, most falsifiable, and most systematically dismissed body of work in this entire investigation. We will show you his method. We will show you his numbers. And then, because this is not a courtroom that only hears one side, we will show you exactly where mainstream chronology fights back and where, after weighing both sides honestly, the evidence actually lands. This is episode 1 of a 4-part investigation into what we are calling the Renaissance Reinvention, the hypothesis that somewhere between the 14th and the 17th centuries, the people who controlled Europe's presses, pulpits, and ledgers did not merely record history, they re-engineered it. Episode 1 builds the mathematical and documentary case. Episode 2 will take you to the star forts, the mud floods, and the vanished infrastructure of a world David Ewing Jr. and the online Tartaria community called the Hidden Empire. Episode 3 will take you east, into Armenia, into Khazaria, into the Targumic manuscripts that may preserve a memory of a Semitic world, the official record buried beneath a single, later, competing national narrative. Episode 4 will take this investigation's own accumulated evidence to its furthest honest conclusion, underground, into a hypothesis this series offers as its own closing argument, rather than a claim borrowed from any outside source. Tonight, we start where any honest forensic investigation must start, with the clock itself. Who was Joseph Justus Scaliger, and why does his name not appear in your history textbook? Ask 10 people who studied European history at a Western university to name the person who determined the chronological framework in which every date they memorized sits, and you will get 10 blank stares. This is itself worth noting. We are trained extensively in the content of history, the battles, the treaties, the kings, and almost never in the history of history, the discipline that decided which century a given event belongs to in the first place. That discipline has an author. His name was Joseph Justus Scaliger, born in Agen, France, in 1540, dead in Leiden, in the Dutch Republic, in 1609. Scaliger was the son of Julius Caesar Scaliger, an Italian physician and scholar who drilled his son in Latin composition from an early age, reportedly requiring 80 lines of Latin verse a day before the boy had even reached his teens. After his father's death, the young Scaliger studied at the University of Paris under the Greek scholar Adrianus Turnebus, and by his own account, having found the university's formal lectures inadequate, taught himself to read Homer in 21 days and then proceeded through the entire corpus of classical Greek poetry, oratory, and history, building his own grammar as he went. At the suggestion of the Orientalist Guillaume Postel, he then acquired Hebrew, and after that, Arabic. This was not an ordinary education. This was the education of a man being groomed, whether he understood it that way or not, to become the single most authoritative voice in Europe on the question of how the past should be dated and organized. He found his patron in Louis de Chastener, Lord of La Roche-Posay, in whose household Scaliger lived for roughly 2 decades, absorbing the kind of aristocratic access and financial security that produced the leisure for sustained scholarly labor. After the outbreak of renewed religious violence in France, Scaliger was a Calvinist convert living through the wars of religion, a period in which being on the wrong side of a confessional line could cost a scholar his life. He eventually accepted a position at the University of Leiden in 1593. And here is where the documentary record becomes genuinely significant. Because Leiden was not a neutral academic institution floating above the political currents of its era. It had been founded in 1575 by William of Orange, the leader of the Dutch revolt against Habsburg Spain, as an instrument of a new Protestant state that needed trained administrators, jurists, theologians, and critically, a historical identity independent of and defensible against the Catholic Habsburg Empire it was fighting to escape. Scaliger's position came with an extraordinary salary and, notably, no teaching duties. He was paid by the States of Holland simply to produce scholarship. That is a documented, uncontroversial case of a merchant republic purchasing prestige history on retainer. The scholarship he produced was his life's central project, a system for reconciling the entire chronological record of the ancient world Hebrew genealogies from the Old Testament, Greek Olympiad victor lists, Roman consular registers, Egyptian dynastic king lists, Persian regnal records, and the fragmentary astronomical notices scattered through late antique and early medieval manuscripts into one single, internally consistent timeline. His major published works were the Opus Novum de Emendatione Temporum, published in Paris in 1583, and the Thesaurus Temporum, published in Leyden in 1606, 3 years before his death. Understand precisely what these books were. They were not excavations. Scaliger did not dig a timeline up out of the ground the way an archaeologist recovers a buried city. He built a timeline out of paper, reconciling sources that frequently contradicted one another, choosing which contradictory source to trust when they disagreed, correcting what he judged to be scribal errors in the numbers he inherited, and selecting which calendar conversion method to apply when bridging between, for instance, a Greek Olympiad count and a Roman consular year. Every one of those choices is a form of construction. A person who chooses which of two disagreeing ancient sources is correct is not reporting a fact. He is rendering a judgment, and that judgment becomes the fact that every subsequent generation of students receives as settled history. His most celebrated technical innovation, the Julian period, makes this constructedness undeniable on its own terms, because it is transparently an artificial mathematical device. Scaliger combined 3 separate astronomical cycles: the 28-year solar cycle, the 19-year lunar cycle, and the 15-year indiction cycle used in Roman and Byzantine tax administration by multiplying them together, 28 times 19 times 15, which produces 7,980 years. He then used this artificially constructed supercycle as a universal numbering system, independent of and prior to the Christian Anno Domini dating scheme, specifically so that dates from incompatible calendar systems, Jewish, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, could all be converted onto one shared numerical spine. This does not, by itself, prove fraud. What it proves, beyond any reasonable dispute, is that chronology in the 16th century was being deliberately engineered as an administrative and scholarly control mechanism, a tool built by a specific man for a specific purpose, using specific artificial mathematics, not a neutral fact discovered lying in the archaeological record, waiting to be read off like a thermometer. The money behind the manuscripts. If Scaliger built the chronological framework, the next question a forensic investigation must ask is simple. Who paid for the raw materials he built it from? Because the recovery of classical antiquity that made the entire Renaissance chronological project possible in the first place, the rediscovery, copying, editing, and printing of Greek and Latin manuscripts that had survived, if they survived at all, through a bottleneck of monastery libraries and scattered private collections, did not happen through some spontaneous, disinterested outpouring of scholarly curiosity. It happened because specific banking dynasties, specific merchant courts, and specific ecclesiastical institutions decided to fund it, and their reasons for funding it were financial, dynastic, and confessional, not purely intellectual. Consider the documented record. The Medici family of Florence funded libraries, manuscript hunting expeditions, translators, philosophers, and the printing infrastructure that turned rediscovered classical texts into the standardized editions later scholars like Scaliger would cite as sources. The Fugger banking family of Augsburg, whose fortune was built on Central European silver and copper mining and on financing the Holy Roman Empire's wars, similarly funded libraries and scholarly patronage as a documented pattern of imperial finance. The Plantin Moretus printing house of Antwerp, operating under Habsburg print privileges, became one of the largest publishing enterprises in Europe, producing the biblical, liturgical, and scholarly texts that gave the new chronological consensus its physical, distributable form. The Estienne printing family of Paris and Geneva published the standard Greek and Latin editions that chronologers of Scaliger's generation relied upon as their base texts, and the Habsburg and Bourbon courts granted the print privileges, the pensions, the university professorships, and the censorship permissions that determined which scholarly voices reached a printed, durable, citable audience, and which did not. This matters for a reason that goes well beyond simple guilt by association. The individuals and institutions financing wars, mining operations, colonial trade, sovereign debt, printing presses, universities, and court historians were, in a very large number of documented cases, the same individuals and institutions. Bankers and dynasts needed stable, legally enforceable time because debts, bonds, leases, and charters all require an agreed-upon calendar to be enforceable across years and across jurisdictions. They needed prestigious origin myths, acclaimed descent from Troy, from Rome, from biblical Israel, from whatever ancient lineage a given royal house wished to graft its legitimacy onto. And they needed control of print control over who was permitted to publish calendars, Bibles, and histories. Because in a world without mass literacy or independent verification, the printed page functioned as the primary interface between a claimed past and a believing public. Whoever controlled type, print privilege, and distribution controlled what counted in the eyes of a Renaissance reader as a legitimate historical source. That is elite power exercised directly over the archive, not a metaphor, not a suspicion, but a documented material fact about who owned the presses. It is essential, in the interest of intellectual honesty, to state clearly what this evidence does and does not prove. It proves that chronology was elite-sponsored knowledge, assembled and disseminated through institutions with fiscal and dynastic interests in a particular outcome. It does not, by itself, prove that every specific date in that chronology was invented on purpose, or that a specific banking house issued a specific instruction to fabricate a specific century. The distinction matters enormously because a case built on the stronger, unproven claim collapses the moment a skeptical cross-examiner asks for the underlying paper trail and, as we are about to see, in at least one specific and highly consequential case, that paper trail runs in a very different direction than the total fabrication thesis expects. And this pattern of patron-shaped history did not begin with Scaliger, he inherited it. Flavius Josephus, the historian whose Antiquities of the Jews and Jewish War anchor the entire Second Temple chronology every later chronologer built on, surrendered to the Roman general Vespasian during the Jewish revolt he had commanded troops against, took his patron's family name, and lived out his life on a Roman pension and citizenship granted by the very dynasty whose triumph his histories narrate. Eusebius of Caesarea, whose chronicle is the direct ancestor of the entire Anno Mundi dating system Scaliger later systematized, was a personal friend and biographer of the Emperor Constantine, writing the official chronological memory of Christianity's imperial rise for the emperor who made that rise possible. Neither of these facts, by itself, proves a single date either man recorded is false. That would be exactly the kind of unearned leap this investigation has already committed not to make. But naming them plainly, 12th and 16th centuries respectively before Scaliger, establishes something this investigation considers important. Elite patronized chronology is not a Renaissance invention. It is the normal condition under which most surviving ancient chronology was produced, and Scaliger's story is one chapter in a much longer one, not its origin. The forgery that actually happened and who stopped it here is where this investigation must, in fairness to the evidence, complicate its own narrative, because the actual documented history of Renaissance chronological forgery does not point where a simple, elite bankers commissioned fake history story would predict. It points somewhere more specific, more damning in a narrower sense, and more revealing about how institutional power actually operates on the historical record. In 1498, a Dominican friar named Giovanni Nanni, writing under the name Annius of Viterbo, published a work titled Antiquities. Annius did not merely reinterpret existing ancient sources. He fabricated entirely new ones, inventing a fake text attributed to the Babylonian priest historian Berosus, a fake text attributed to the Egyptian priest historian Manetho, a fake text attributed to the Roman annalist Fabius Pictor, and a fake text attributed to an invented authority he called Metasthenes. From these forged sources, Annius constructed a chronology engineered to serve very specific political ends. It gave the city of Viterbo and the ancient Etruscan people priority and prestige over the Greeks. It manufactured an ancient royal pedigree for the Spanish crown, and it flattered his patron, the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, who rewarded Annius by appointing him master of the sacred palace, one of the most powerful curial offices in Rome. This forgery was not a minor footnote. It was believed cited, and built upon by scholars and noble genealogists across Italy and Spain for the better part of a century, precisely because it served the dynastic and papal interests of the men with the power to promote it. This is not second-hand description. The original 1498 printing of Annius's forgery survives and has been digitized, a copy held today by the Boston Public Library, catalogued in its own library record as a collection of spurious fragments purporting to be the work of Merciless Lesbius, Cato, Archilochus, Metasthenes, Xenophon, Berosus, Manetho, and other Greek and Roman writers, but probably fabricated by Annius. The forger's handiwork is not a matter of inference from later commentary. It is sitting, page-scanned and publicly viewable, in a rare books collection 500 years later, catalogued by the very kind of careful librarianship this investigation depends on to make its case. Now follow the thread carefully, because this is the detail that a fair-minded forensic investigation cannot skip past. Scaliger's own critical philological circle attacked Annius's forgery and eventually destroyed its credibility. His contemporary, Isaac Casaubon, in 1614, applied rigorous linguistic analysis to prove that the so-called Hermetic corpus, a body of mystical philosophical texts that Medici-funded Florentine Platonists, including Marsilio Ficino, had staked enormous intellectual prestige on as genuine relics of ancient Egyptian wisdom, was in fact composed centuries after the birth of Christ, not by ancient Egyptian priests at all. Casaubon's demonstration, built on purely linguistic and stylistic grounds, demolished a text tradition the Medici had spent generations promoting. So the actual pattern visible in the documented record runs like this. Elite patrons, a Borgia pope. Florentine Medici bankers funded fabricated ancient pedigrees that served their dynastic and confessional interests. And it was the critical chronologers, Scaliger's own tradition, who tore those fabrications apart. If your working hypothesis is that Scaliger and his school were the engine of historical fabrication in the service of elite power, the documented record of Annius of Viterbo and the Hermetic corpus does not confirm that hypothesis. It inverts it. This is precisely the kind of evidence a rigorous investigation is obligated to present, even when it complicates the thesis, because a case that only shows you the evidence supporting its conclusion is not a case. It is a sermon. The full roster, 1300s to 1800s. A 5-century case file. This investigation's scope, at the widest angle it is prepared to defend, spans the full window historians call the Little Ice Age, roughly the 1300s through the 1800s, because that is the window in which chronology and history were being actively built, rebuilt, and fought over by named, documented people with named, documented patrons. Annius of Viterbo is not an isolated case. He sits inside a 5-century chain, and a jury deserves to see the whole chain, not one link. The chain opens roughly a century before Annius, with the poet Francesco Petrarca Petrarch, writing under the patronage of the Avignon papal court, and the Colonna family in the 1300s. Petrarch did not forge a single document. He did something quieter and, in its own way, more foundational. He was the first writer on record to describe the centuries between Rome's fall and his own age as a benighted interval, the conceptual seed of what later became the Dark Ages, and, by flattering contrast, his own era's self-applied label, the Renaissance, the rebirth. A label is not a forgery, but a label that flatters the person applying it, and that every subsequent humanist scholar inherited without question, is exactly the kind of quiet, foundational reinvention this investigation exists to notice. 60 years before Annius, in 1440, the scholar Lorenzo Valla exposed what remains the single longest-running proven forgery on this entire roster, the donation of Constantine, a document that had ruled European politics for 6 centuries before he unmasked it. We will walk through that case in full later in this hour, because it deserves the space. For now, note only the detail this roster is built to surface. Valla did this work employed by King Alfonso V of Naples and Aragon, a monarch locked in active territorial dispute with the papacy, at the exact moment his scholar produced the exposure. The forgery was real. Its exposure was every bit as patron-motivated as its creation. A century after Annius, in the 1550s and 1560s, the pattern repeats as a matched pair on opposite sides of the Reformation. Matthias Flacius, backed by Lutheran princes, produced the Magdeburg Centuries, a Protestant church history organized century by century and explicitly designed to prove Rome had corrupted a purer early Christianity. The papacy's answer came from Cardinal Cesare Baronio, made a cardinal and Vatican librarian specifically to produce the 12-volume Annales Ecclesiastici, the Counter-Reformation's point-by-point rebuttal. 2 institutions, 2 salaried historians, one argument fought entirely through competing, selectively sourced accounts of the same distant past. And then, remarkably, the man who continued Scaliger's own chronological project after his death was not a fellow Calvinist. He was a Jesuit named Denis Petau, personally invited to Madrid by King Philip IV of Spain, and later summoned to Rome by Pope Urban VIII. A Calvinist paid by a Protestant Dutch republic built the system. A Jesuit paid by the Spanish crown and the papacy refined it. Both landed, in the end, on substantially the same chronological framework, which a fair jury should weigh honestly both ways, either as evidence the framework has real cross-confessional support, or as evidence that both men were drawing from the same limited, already compromised pool of surviving manuscripts, no matter who signed their salary. The pattern does not end with the Renaissance. It runs straight through the Little Ice Age's final century. In 1760, the Scottish writer James Macpherson published poems he claimed were his translation of an ancient Gaelic epic by a bard named Ossian Poems that modern scholarship, including Wikipedia's own summary of the consensus, holds Macpherson largely composed himself in service of a Scottish national identity actively under threat after the crushing of the 1745 Jacobite Rising. In the same decade, a Bristol teenager named Thomas Chatterton fabricated an entire corpus of invented medieval poetry, seeking the patronage that never fully came, and died by his own hand at 17. And in the 1790s, a young clerk named William Henry Ireland, exploiting his own father's desperate hunger for genuine Shakespeare manuscripts, none of which exist in Shakespeare's own hand, for any of his 37 plays, forged an entire lost Shakespeare play, staged in London in 1796, citing Chatterton and Macpherson by name as his inspiration. Read start to finish, this is not evidence of one Renaissance-era plot. It is evidence of a 5th-century, continuously documented human behavior. Wherever an institution, a nation, or an individual stood to gain from a specific version of the past, someone, somewhere, produced one. And in nearly every case on this list, we know their name, their patron, and their motive, because the paper trail survived. That is the honest foundation this investigation stands on before a single, more speculative claim is introduced. Two credentialed men who said the whole edifice was fiction, centuries before Fomenko. Every name on the roster so far either forged something or fought over the meaning of something. Two more names belong here, and they are different in kind. They were not forgers at all, but credentialed, institutionally respectable scholars who looked at the entire received chronology of the ancient and medieval world and concluded, on their own authority, that most of it was invented. Jean Hardouin was a Jesuit priest, librarian, and classical scholar, employed at one of France's most prestigious institutions, the Lycée Louis le Grand in Paris, and entrusted with producing the standard critical editions of Themistius and Pliny, the elder respectable mainstream philological work. And yet, in a work titled Ad Censuram Scriptorum Veterum Prolegomena, a prolegomena to the censure of ancient writers published after his death in 1766, Hardouin argued that the overwhelming majority of supposedly classical Greek and Roman literature had, in fact, been forged by monks in the 13th century. Wikipedia's own info box for Hardouin lists, among the people he directly influenced, one name that should stop this investigation's audience cold: Anatoly Fomenko. The mathematician's entire chronology revision project has a credentialed, institutionally respectable, 300-year-old French Jesuit precedent, and that precedent's original Latin text survives and has been digitized. Copies of the 1766 printing are held and viewable today, meaning this is not a second-hand claim about what Hardouin argued. It is Hardouin's own argument, in his own words, still on the record. Edwin Johnson took the claim in a different English direction more than a century later. An English historian, writing in his 1887 book Antiqua Mater and his later The Rise of English Culture, Johnson concluded there was no reliable documentary evidence for the historical existence of Jesus Christ or the Apostles, and went further still. He argued that the entire span of history between roughly the years 700 and 1400, what popular history calls the Dark Ages, never happened as described at all, and had been substantially invented by Christian monks, chiefly Benedictines, during the early 16th century, drawing up an entire imaginary cast of church fathers, gospel authors, and historical events from nothing. A contemporary reviewer, writing in the New York Times in 1904, summarized Johnson's claim with a headline that could serve as this entire series' own working title, "The Abolition of History." Johnson later personally translated Hadwin's Latin Prolegomena into English. In 1909, explicitly carrying that older Jesuit's argument forward into the next century, both men's original texts, Hadwin's Latin original and Johnson's own English translation of it, survive and have been digitized today. Here is the honest accounting this investigation owes both men, exactly as it has owed one to every other name on this roster. Neither Hadwin's total forgery claim about classical literature nor Johnson's total invention claim about 700 years of medieval history has been accepted by mainstream historical scholarship. Then or now, both are treated correctly as the far edge of source-critical skepticism, not as the consensus position, but the honest point this investigation draws from them is not that they were right. It is that skepticism, this total, this sweeping, aimed at the very foundations of received chronology, is not a 21st century YouTube invention, and it did not begin with a Russian topologist in the 1970s. It has a 300-year lineage of credentialed, published, institutionally embedded scholars willing to say the emperor has no clothes, which means the modern version of this argument inherited its method and its marginalization from a much older, much more respectable family tree than its critics generally admit. The evidence Scaliger could never have touched if the entire pre-modern chronological timeline were 16th and 17th century construction invented, embellished, or artificially compressed by Scaliger and the humanist tradition that followed him, then that timeline should collapse the moment it is tested against physical and documentary evidence that was recovered after Scaliger's death by people with no access to his work, written in scripts that no living European could read at the time he was writing. This is not a hypothetical test. It has already been run repeatedly, and the results are worth walking through in detail because they represent the strongest single category of evidence against the total fabrication hypothesis. Consider the Bur-Sagale eclipse. A Syrian eponym lists annual administrative records used to date events. By naming the official who held a particular office in a given year, were excavated from the ruins of Nineveh in the 1840s and 1850s, buried under an Ottoman-era mound in Mesopotamia. Cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing system in which these records were inscribed, was not deciphered by any European scholar until the 1850s, through the combined work of Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and William Henry Fox Talbot. One of these excavated eponym lists records a solar eclipse occurring in the month of Simanu during the year an official named Bur-Sagale held the eponymous office. Modern celestial mechanics, the same physics that lets astronomers predict eclipses centuries into the future, with mathematical precision, allows this eclipse to be calculated backward with equal precision, and it lands on the 15th of June, 763 years before the Common Era. That single administrative line, recovered from underground, in a script no European could read, 2.5 centuries after Scaliger's death, anchors the entire framework of Assyrian regnal chronology. Absolutely. And through the network of diplomatic and military synchronisms connecting Assyria to its neighbors, it anchors Babylonian and Levantine chronology along with it. Joseph Scaliger died in 1609. He could not read cuneiform. No living person could read cuneiform. The tablets that fix this date were sitting under a mound in territory he never visited, in a language no one on earth could decode, for 250 years after his death. The pattern repeats. Thousands of Babylonian astronomical diary tablets, spanning roughly the 7th through the 1st centuries before the Common Era, and recording lunar positions, planetary positions, eclipses, solstices, and even commodity prices, were excavated from Babylon and Uruk across the 19th and 20th centuries. When modern astronomers retrocalculate the celestial positions these tablets describe, the resulting dates cross-check directly against the astronomer Ptolemy's ancient Canon of Kings, a cross-check performed using physics and mathematics, not textual argument, and performed by scholars working long after any Renaissance humanist could have influenced the outcome. Beyond text entirely, an entire category of independent physical clocks exists that owes nothing whatsoever to any textual chronology humans have written. Dendrochronology, the dating of wood by counting and cross-matching annual growth rings across European oak, Anatolian, and North American bristlecone pine specimens, requires no historical text at all. It is annual biology, not narrative. Radiocarbon dating, once properly calibrated against these dendrochronological sequences, layers a second independent physical clock on top of the first. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica preserve annual layers marked by volcanic sulfate spikes, entirely independent of any human record keeping. Varve sequences, the annual sediment layers deposited in still lake waters, provide yet a fourth, wholly independent annual clock. And these systems cross-validate each other in ways that no single Renaissance professor could have arranged. The catastrophic volcanic dust veil event of the year 536 of the Common Era appears simultaneously in ice core sulfate spikes, in tree ring growth suppression, and in the independent written records of Byzantine and Chinese historians describing a darkened sun and failed harvests. 3 fully independent evidentiary systems, glacial ice, tree biology, and 2 separate literate civilizations on opposite ends of the Eurasian landmass converge on the same year. That convergence is not something a professor in Leiden arranged from his study, and the Chinese record supplies perhaps the most philosophically devastating evidence of all against the total fabrication hypothesis, because of what it reveals about motive. Chinese dynastic historiography maintained its own continuous tradition of eclipse observation and record keeping, entirely independent of the European chronological tradition. When Jesuit missionary scholars encountered this tradition, and transmitted it back to Europe most consequentially through Martino Martini's 1658 work, Sinicae Historiae Decas Prima. It created a genuine crisis for European chronologists, because the Chinese dynastic record extended further into the past than biblical chronology, as then understood, seemed to permit. If European elites were fabricating a chronology to suit their own convenience, the rational move would have been to fabricate it in a way that avoided contradicting outside data, or to simply suppress the inconvenient outside data once encountered. Instead, the historical record shows European chronologists walking directly into this problem, wrestling with it publicly in print, and spending the following century trying to reconcile biblical and Chinese chronology rather than quietly erasing the contradiction. A fabricated system engineered for elite convenience does not typically manufacture its own inconvenient contradictions and then publish them. Anatoly Fomenko and the Mathematics of Duplicate History. Now we turn to the second half of this episode's investigation and to a figure whose credentials place him in an entirely different category than an internet theorist or an amateur pattern hunter. Anatoly Timofeyevich Fomenko was born in 1945 and rose to become a full member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, a full member of the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences, the head of the Department of Mathematics and Mechanics at Moscow State University, and a working topologist credited with solving Plato's problem in the theory of minimal spectral surfaces and with developing the theory of invariance and topological classification of integrable Hamiltonian dynamical systems. He is the author of more than 200 scientific publications and 28 monographs and textbooks on mathematics, and he was awarded the 1996 National Premium of the Russian Federation in Mathematics. This is not the biography of a fringe amateur. This is the biography of a working, credentialed, publishing mathematician who turned the full weight of his statistical training toward a single, specific, falsifiable question. Is the accepted chronology of ancient and medieval history internally consistent, or does it contain the mathematical signature of duplication? Fomenko's investigation did not begin as a history project. It began in the 1970s with a problem in celestial mechanics, specifically the secular acceleration of the moon, the slow, physically predictable change in the moon's orbital speed caused by tidal interaction with the Earth. An American astrophysicist named Robert Russell Newton, the head of NASA's Computer Center for Space Navigation, had used 370 ancient lunar eclipse records drawn from historical chronicles to calculate this acceleration parameter, which astronomers denote with the letter D. Newton's published finding, appearing in his 1977 book, The Crime of Claudius Ptolemy, and in his earlier technical work, was that the calculated D parameter did not follow the smooth curve predicted by tidal friction physics. Instead, somewhere in the window between roughly the 8th century before the Common Era and the 11th century of the Common Era, the record showed a discontinuous, unexplained jump, the moon appearing, according to the eclipse record, to accelerate and then decelerate in a manner inconsistent with the physics that should govern it. Newton, trusting the conventional dates attached to his eclipse records, attempted to patch this anomaly by proposing unknown, unspecified non-gravitational forces acting on the moon, an admission, by its very nature, that the raw data did not fit the accepted model without an ad hoc rescue. Fomenko, encountering Newton's published anomaly, took a different approach. Rather than inventing new physics to explain away a data problem, he asked whether the problem might instead lie in the dates conventionally attached to the eclipse records themselves. He substituted the conventional dating of certain ancient eclipse records with a set of revised dates that had been proposed decades earlier by Nikolai Morozov, a Russian scientist and encyclopedist who had independently argued for a comprehensive revision of ancient chronology using early 20th century astronomical methods. When Fomenko reran Newton's calculations using Morozov's revised dates, he reported that the anomalous jump in the lunar acceleration curve disappeared, replaced by the smooth, physically consistent horizontal line that tidal friction physics predicts. His inference, and the seed from which his entire subsequent research program grew, was that the anomaly was never a problem with the moon. It was a problem with the dates humans had assigned to the eclipse records, meaning that at least some portion of the conventionally accepted chronology of ancient history was, quite simply, wrong. Before weighing that finding, this investigation owes Fomenko the same scrutiny it has already applied to Scaliger, because a deception detection method that only points one direction is not a method at all. So, who is Fomenko, and what does he stand to gain? He is a full member of the Russian Academy of Sciences and a department head at Moscow State University's Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics, a real, credentialed, state-employed mathematician whose independently peer-reviewed topology work is genuinely distinguished and entirely unconnected to chronology. Mainstream reference sources categorize him plainly as a conspiracy theorist and his new chronology as pseudo-history, and this investigation has no reason to soften that verdict. There is no documented evidence that his chronology work was state-funded as a nationalist project, and no identifiable Russian state interest it serves. What the evidence does show is 4 decades of sustained personal conviction, defended against near total rejection by his own National Academy of Historians, a pattern more consistent with committed belief, quite possibly hardened by decades of confirmation bias, than with a funded propaganda operation, naming that plainly does not refute his mathematics. It simply means his mathematics gets weighed on its own evidence, exactly like everyone else's in this investigation, and not treated as automatically more trustworthy merely because it comes from outside the mainstream. The intellectually honest position on this specific finding, and it is worth stating with precision because both overclaiming and dismissing it would be dishonest, is this. The anomaly Robert Newton published is real, peer-reviewed, and remains, to this day, without a fully satisfying mainstream explanation beyond an admittedly ad hoc rescue. That anomaly does not, by itself, prove that centuries of history are fictional, What it proves is that the eclipse record used to calibrate the medieval period is either incomplete, corrupted somewhere in its long chain of manuscript transmission, or observationally imperfect in a way that produces a genuine, documented mathematical discrepancy. Fomenko's next move, testing whether shifting the anomalous eclipses to different centuries smooths the physics back out, is a legitimate statistical exploration of that discrepancy. It becomes illegitimate only at the moment it is presented as proof, rather than as one candidate explanation competing against far more mundane alternatives. Chief among them, the simple fact that medieval European record-keeping, especially in the centuries following the administrative collapse of the Western Roman Empire, was sparse, inconsistently preserved, and prone to exactly the kind of transcription drift that would produce spurious anomalies without requiring any conspiracy whatsoever. The form code. Fomenko's statistical fingerprint for detecting duplicate dynasties. Whatever one concludes about the lunar eclipse anomaly that launched his research, the methodology Fomenko subsequently developed to search for duplication across recorded history is, on its own terms, a serious piece of applied statistics, and it deserves to be examined with the same rigor a peer reviewer would apply to any submitted paper not waved away with the word fringe and left unexamined, and not accepted uncritically simply because its author holds real academic credentials. Working alongside his collaborator, Gleb Nosovsky, also of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics at Moscow State University, along with the statistician Vladimir Kalashnikov and the computational mathematician Tatiana Fomenko, Fomenko developed what he called a form code, a standardized 34-item questionnaire applied uniformly to historical rulers across recorded dynasties. Each ruler in the database is coded for gender, total lifespan, duration of reign, institutional status, whether the figure functioned as emperor, military commander, religious leader, or some combination recorded cause of death, and the presence or absence of specific correlated events during the reign, natural disasters, notable astronomical phenomena, wars, and recorded conspiracies. Applying this form code systematically to hundreds of major historical rulers, Fomenko's team assembled sequences of consecutive rulers within a single dynasty into what he termed a flow of form codes, and then plotted this flow as a graph, the horizontal axis representing each ruler's ordinal position in the succession sequence, the vertical axis representing that ruler's total years in power. The resulting jagged line, Fomenko argued, constitutes a dynasty profile, a graphical signature that functions, by analogy, something like a fingerprint, unique to the specific historical sequence of rulers it represents. The comparison method that follows from this is the mathematically interesting part. Two dynasty profiles, drawn from supposedly unrelated times and places in conventional history, are plotted against one another in some of Fomenko's illustrated material. One profile is mirrored on the same axis, specifically to make visual comparison easier for a lay audience. Fomenko and Nosovsky then calculated a statistical closeness factor between paired profiles, and in several specific highlighted cases, they report that the probability of the observed degree of similarity arising by pure random chance is approximately 1 in 100 billion. Among the specific duplicate pairs, their published material highlights the ruling dynasty of the ancient kingdom of Judah, conventionally dated to roughly the 7th through 6th centuries before the Common Era, matched against the ruling dynasty of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, conventionally dated centuries later. The medieval Holy Roman Empire matched against the medieval Habsburg Empire, and a ruling dynasty of ancient Rome matched against a ruling dynasty of medieval Europe. Fomenko's own interpretation of these matches offers two possible mechanisms. The first is unintentional. Early and linguistically underdeveloped historical scholarship may have misread a single original set of documents describing one dynasty as describing two separate dynasties, subsequently assigning the misread duplicate new names and relocating it, on paper, to a different era and a different geography. The second mechanism, which Fomenko states more provocatively, is intentional, that unnamed powerful forces of the medieval period deliberately rewrote and duplicated segments of the historical record for reasons connected to concealment. The case for and against the form code. A serious peer-level critique of this methodology exists, and intellectual honesty requires presenting it in full rather than only presenting Fomenko's side of the argument. Critics, including formal commissions convened by the Russian Academy of Sciences itself, the very institution of which Fomenko is a member, argue that reign length data is not statistically independent or random in the way Fomenko's probability calculations implicitly assume, because human biology constrains reign lengths in predictable, recurring ways regardless of era or geography. Average human lifespans cluster within a fairly narrow physiological range, meaning that similar-looking reign length distributions will naturally recur across genuinely unrelated dynasties, simply because human bodies age and die at broadly similar rates everywhere on Earth, in every century. Critics further argue that the 34-item form code allows meaningful subjective judgment in how a given historical figure's reign is scored, and that this subjectivity can artificially inflate the apparent similarity between two profiles that a more neutral coding scheme would show to be less alike. And critics note, correctly, that Fomenko's specific probability calculations have never been independently replicated by an outside statistical team working to mainstream peer review standards. The verification, such as it exists, has come almost entirely from within Fomenko's own research group. But a fair-minded investigation must also state the corresponding weakness on the other side of this exchange, because it is real and it matters. No mainstream historian has, to date, published a full, direct, point-by-point statistical reanalysis that takes Fomenko's specific numerical claims and refutes them using an independently constructed dataset and an independently specified methodology. The institutional response to Fomenko's work has been overwhelmingly qualitative and reputational dismissal by professional consensus, exclusion from mainstream historical journals, informal characterization as pseudoscience, rather than a head-to-head quantitative rebuttal published with its own citable methodology. If the goal of a scholarly discipline is genuine truth-seeking rather than the defense of institutional territory, an unreplicated but also unrebutted statistical claim from a credentialed mathematician working within a named, described, reproducible methodology deserves a mathematical answer, not merely an institutional shrug. That gap between the seriousness of the mathematical challenge and the thinness of the mathematical response is itself part of the evidence this investigation is built to weigh. The empire the textbooks never named Fomenko and Nosowski did not stop at identifying statistically matched dynasty pairs. They extended their conclusions into a full alternative reconstruction of the medieval world, one so far outside the conventional narrative that it deserves to be presented plainly, in their own terms, before this investigation weighs it. Their central historical claim is that the conventionally accepted global chronology of antiquity and the Middle Ages was artificially lengthened, meaning that many of the separate ancient civilizations, dynasties, and empires described in standard textbooks are not, in fact, temporally and geographically distinct societies at all. They are duplicate, or, in Fomenko's own term, phantom reflections of the same medieval events, dynasties, and human beings, recorded more than once, under different invented names, assigned to different invented places, at different invented dates. Under this reconstruction, a single vast unified empire, which Fomenko and Nosowski provisionally name the Great Horde Empire, and which the independent online Tartaria research community has separately arrived at and dubbed Tartaria, is proposed to have existed from roughly the 14th century through the early 17th century, spanning the Eurasian landmass, and, in their more expansive claims, extending into portions of the Americas as well. Its capital, in their reconstruction, sat first in Istanbul and later relocated to Moscow, a claim they connect to the historically documented alliance between the Ottoman Empire and what they call the Russian Horde, and to the genuinely real early modern slogan describing an empire on which the sun never set, a phrase conventionally associated with the 16th century Habsburg Empire of Charles V. Under this framework, the Roman Empire, the medieval Islamic Caliphate, the Chinese Empire, and the Empire of Charlemagne are proposed to be historiographic reflections of this single medieval empire, artificially separated on paper into what appear to be independent, temporally sequential civilizations, when in Fomenko's reconstruction they are, in fact, one civilization recorded 4 separate times. We will return to the Great Horde Empire hypothesis and to David Ewing Jr. is independent and considerably more expansive extension of it, including the claim that vast quantities of Arabic inscribed coinage and regalia recovered across northeastern Europe and Russia represent physical, unexplained evidence of this hidden empire's true religious and linguistic character in episode 2 of this investigation, where we will place that claim alongside the star forts, the vanished industrial infrastructure disguised as churches and mosques, and the physical evidence of catastrophic global flooding that the online Tartaria community has assembled. For tonight, hold this claim in the same evidentiary category as Fomenko's dynasty matching statistics. Interesting, mathematically motivated, unreplicated, and unrefuted by any comparably rigorous counter-analysis, which is precisely the epistemic condition in which the most consequential, unresolved questions in any discipline tend to live. The radiocarbon clock that was calibrated against itself, no investigation of chronological manipulation would be complete without confronting the scientific dating method that most people assume settles these questions independently of any human historian's judgment. Radiocarbon dating. And here, the documented history of the method's own founding contains a genuine, serious, and largely unpublicized methodological problem, one that the new chronology researchers have highlighted extensively, and one that deserves to be presented with full attention to both its real substance and its real limits. Willard Libby, the physicist who invented radiocarbon dating in the late 1940s, documented in his own writing that the initial calibration of his method depended on archaeologists supplying him with samples whose age was already believed to be known from conventional historical chronology. Libby's own words on this point are direct. In general, he wrote, the archaeologists know the dates better than we can measure them. This is, on its face, a circular calibration, a physical measurement technique being tuned to agree with the very historical chronology it would later be cited as independently confirming. One of Libby's own reference samples, drawn from Egyptologist James Henry Breasted's collection and attributed to Egypt's 5th dynasty, conventionally dated to roughly 2,500 years before the Common Era, returned a radiocarbon result indicating the sample was modern. Libby himself described the day this result came back as, in his own phrase, a dark day. Subsequent documented failures compound the concern. The archaeologist Vladimir Milojcic ran radiocarbon tests on living specimens of precisely known age and recorded startling inconsistencies. A living American mollusk shell dated to 1,200 years old. A living North African wild rose dated as having been dead for 360 years. A living Australian eucalyptus tree effectively dated as not yet existing for another 600 years into the future. A Florida shell projected to only begin existing over 1,000 years in the future. Reports published in Nature and in the Antarctic Journal of the United States documented an English castle of precisely known documented construction age 738 years, returning a radiocarbon date of 7,370 years, an era exceeding 6.5 millennia. Freshly killed seals return dates of 1,300 years old. Seals known to have been mummified only 30 years prior returned dates of 4,600 years old. The standard reference literature used in radiocarbon laboratories' catalogues, no fewer than 9 distinct, unresolved, and largely unquantified sources of variance in the method: geographic latitude and longitude, proximity to geological carbonate rock formations, contamination from volcanic carbonate emissions, with Italy specifically flagged as a high-risk case given its proximity to the still active volcanoes Vesuvius and Etna, altitude above sea level, and regional climate, among others. Taken together, the new chronology researchers conclude that radiocarbon dating in its foundational calibration state carries a deviation of 1 to 2,000 years for any object whose true age is under 1,000 years, which is precisely the historical window most in dispute in this entire investigation. Intellectual honesty requires the corresponding caveat, and it is a substantial one. Every documented failure catalogued above dates from the 1950s and 1960s, the earliest and least sophisticated decades of the radiocarbon method's development. Mainstream archaeological science has, in the decades since, constructed extensive independent calibration curves built from dendrochronological tree ring sequences and, more recently, from uranium series and Lake Varve sequences consolidated into what is now known as the INTCAL series, specifically engineered to correct for the variant sources catalogued above. Modern accelerator mass spectrometry radiocarbon dating, the standard method used since the 1980s, bears very little resemblance in precision to the Libby-era method being critiqued in the failures just described. The fair conclusion, then, is a genuinely two-sided one. The new chronology material is largely built on documented, real, historically accurate failures from radiocarbon dating's founding era, and it does not appear, in the sourced material, to fully engage with the substantial precision improvements of the modern calibrated method, a real weakness in how the argument is typically presented. And yet, the deeper structural point survives that weakness entirely intact. Radiocarbon dating's authority was, as a matter of documented history, circularly calibrated against Scaligerian chronology at its very founding. That is not a fringe accusation. It is a methodological concern that careful historians of science acknowledge to this day, even as they trust the modern, recalibrated version of the method for most practical archaeological purposes. The Egyptologists who could not agree within 2,000 years. A final piece of documentary evidence deserves inclusion here, because it comes not from Fomenko, not from Ewing, and not from any revisionist source at all, but directly from the internal disagreements of 19th century mainstream Egyptology, a discipline that, at the height of its confident colonial-era authority, could not agree on the founding date of ancient Egypt to within 2,000 years. The Egyptologist Heinrich Brugsch, writing in direct dispute with his own professional contemporaries, catalogued the wildly divergent dates German scholars had proposed for the accession of Menes, Egypt's first pharaoh. Boek placed it at 5700, 2 years before the Common Era. Unger at 5600, 13. Brugsch's own preferred date was 4455. Loth proposed 4157. Lepsius 38. 192. Bunsen 36. 123. That is, a spread exceeding 2,000 years among credentialed academic contemporaries working within the same discipline, in the same century, evaluating substantially the same body of evidence. French Egyptology fared no better. Champollion, the decipherer of the Rosetta Stone, proposed 5867 years before the Common Era. Palmer proposed 2224, a difference of 3643 years between two of the most credentialed specialists of their era, both examining the same founding event of the same civilization. This does not, by itself, prove that Egyptian chronology is wrong today. Modern Egyptology has substantially tightened this range through cross-referenced astronomical records tied to the Sothic calendar cycle, through synchronisms with independently dated neighboring Near Eastern civilizations, and yes, through calibrated radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from securely stratified tomb contexts. But the 19th century record stands as a permanent documented reminder that the modern consensus we now treat as settled fact was, within living memory of the discipline's own founders, a matter of 2,000-year disagreement among the most qualified people alive to judge it. Chronology construction, in other words, is demonstrably a human, revisable, consensus-building process, not a fact directly observed off the surface of nature, the way a thermometer reading is observed. That is the single most important epistemological conclusion this entire episode has been built to establish. And it is true whether or not a single word of Fomenko's more dramatic Great Horde Empire reconstruction survives further scrutiny. The decretals that ruled Europe for 600 years on a forged signature Annius of Viterbo was not the only, nor even the most consequential, documented forgery to shape the medieval and early modern chronological record. And a thorough investigation owes its audience the second case, because it dwarfs the first in duration and in institutional weight. Sometime in the 9th century, an anonymous forger or group of forgers, writing under the invented name Isidore Mercator, produced a collection of documents now known to historians as the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, a body of supposed papal letters and church council rulings, many of them attributed to popes who lived centuries before the documents were actually written, assembled and circulated specifically to bolster the claimed authority of the papacy over regional bishops. Among the forged documents bundled into this collection was the donation of Constantine, a text purporting to record the Roman Emperor Constantine's 4th century grant of temporal authority over Rome and the Western Empire to Pope Sylvester I, a donation Constantine never actually made, in a document Constantine never actually signed, produced by hands working centuries after both men were dead. This forgery was not exposed and dismantled the way Annius's forgeries eventually were. It was cited as genuine, invoked as legal and theological precedent, and used to justify real, consequential claims of papal temporal power over the better part of 600 years, before the Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla finally exposed the donation of Constantine as a fraud in 1440, using precisely the same kind of linguistic and stylistic analysis that would later demolish Annius and the Hermetic corpus. And Valla's own patron matters here, In the same way, every patron on this investigation's roster matters. He undertook this exposure in the employ of King Alfonso V of Naples and Aragon, a monarch who was, at that exact moment, locked in active territorial dispute with the very papacy this exposure would embarrass. The forgery does not become less real because its unmasking was also politically convenient. For the man who funded it, both facts set true at once, and a rigorous investigation reports both rather than the one that flatters its own thesis. 6 centuries. That is how long a single, provably forged document created by anonymous hands, attributed to a dead emperor who never wrote it, and cited by an unbroken line of popes who either believed it or found it too useful to question, successfully functioned as load-bearing legal and theological infrastructure for one of the most powerful institutions in European history. This is worth sitting with, because it establishes something no isolated skeptic's claim could establish on its own. The medieval and Renaissance documentary record that our entire chronological edifice ultimately rests upon passed through a demonstrated, repeated, multi-century pattern of elite institutional forgery, exposed only when a later critical scholar happened to apply the tools to catch it. The donation of Constantine was forged, believed, and weaponized for 600 years. Annius of Viterbo's fake Berosus and fake Manetho were forged, believed, and weaponized for a century. If this pattern repeated even once more, undetected, somewhere in the manuscript record that still underwrites a portion of the conventional timeline, we would have no reliable way of knowing it today, which is precisely why the honest verdict of this investigation cannot be simple trust in the institutional record, even as it also cannot be simple abandonment of every independently corroborated physical clock that record has been cross-checked against. A modern case study in the same problem: who actually controls the record? Today, before this investigation moves forward another step, it owes its audience one uncomfortable piece of self-awareness. Because a project built entirely on asking who controls the historical record and why has an obligation to ask that same question about the tools used to research its own claims, including, repeatedly, in this very episode, Wikipedia. In May of 2005, an anonymous editor posted a fabricated biography of the retired journalist John Seigenthaler on Wikipedia, falsely stating he had been thought to have been directly involved in the assassinations of both John and Robert Kennedy. Seigenthaler had, in fact, been Robert Kennedy's administrative assistant and, later, his pallbearer, the single true sentence buried inside an otherwise invented account. The false biography was copied verbatim, without any independent verification, onto two other reference sites, reference.com and answers.com. It stood on Wikipedia, uncorrected in substance, for 132 days. The only edit made during that entire span corrected a single misspelling. When Seigenthaler personally asked Wikipedia's founder, Jimmy Wales, whether the anonymous author could be identified, Wales told him plainly, "No, we don't." Seigenthaler's own account of this, published in USA Today under his own name, is itself the primary source for everything. Just stated, this is not a rumor about Wikipedia. it is Wikipedia's own most prominent early critic, harmed personally on the record, in his own words. The reason no one could be held accountable is not an accident or an oversight. It is a specific piece of American law. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 states that no provider of an interactive computer service can be treated as the publisher or speaker of content posted by someone else, meaning Wikipedia itself, as a platform, carries none of the legal liability a newspaper or broadcaster would carry for publishing the same defamatory claim under its own name. That is a real, current, actively litigated legal shield, not a technicality invented for this episode, and it is worth naming plainly. The institution millions of people treat as a neutral, self-correcting record of settled fact operates under a law that specifically protects it from the consequences of being wrong about a living person's biography. And unlike a single viral hoax, this is not a one-time failure. Documented, reported cases of coordinated manipulation of Wikipedia stretch across 2 decades. In 2007, journalists using the Wikiscanner tool traced edits directly to corporate and government computers, including edits from the CIA, the FBI, Diebold, and multiple national governments, each smoothing over unflattering material about themselves. In 2011, the British public relations firm Bell Pottinger was caught editing articles about its own paying clients. In 2012, Wikipedia's own administrators uncovered an operation traced to a firm called WikiPR, involving 250 coordinated sock puppet accounts engaged in paid editing for hire. In 2015, an operation called Orange Moody used 381 accounts not merely to insert promotional material, but to extort money from businesses by threatening to publish unflattering versions of their own pages unless they paid to have the friendly version protected. None of this proves any specific claim in this investigation, drawn from Wikipedia or any other source, is false. That would be exactly the unearned leap this series has committed from its first sentence not to take. What it does prove, plainly and on the record, is that the modern institution most people now treat as the neutral, crowd-verified successor to Scaliger's Chronology, a record millions consult daily, believing it to be disinterested, has its own well-documented history of anonymous, unaccountable, sometimes paid, sometimes coordinated manipulation protected by a specific law, shielding the platform from the very liability a newspaper would face for the same false claim. This investigation has used, and will continue to use, Wikipedia as one tool among several, because it is fast, extensive, and frequently accurate. But every claim in this series that matters has been cross-checked wherever possible against primary documents, specialist reporting, and named accountable sources, precisely because the case this series is building that institutions controlling the record are never neutral by default applies with full force to the institutions this series itself had to rely on to build that case. The flood the textbooks buried under a compliment. There is one more piece of evidence this investigation must place on the table before rendering its verdict, and it comes not from a forged manuscript or a statistical anomaly, but from the genuine, uncontested, mainstream paleoclimate record. The record that gives this entire 3-episode investigation its bridge into episode 2's central subject. Sometime around the transition out of what climatologists call the medieval warm period, roughly between 1250 and 1300 of the Common Era, Northern Europe's climate began a documented, catastrophic destabilization. 2 specific flood events anchor this transition in the historical and geological record with total mainstream consensus. The St. Lucia's flood of 1287 and the Grote Mandrenki, the Great Drowning of Men. In 1362, both catastrophic North Sea storm surge events that killed tens of thousands of people and permanently redrew the coastline of the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. These are not fringe claims. They are standard, footnoted entries in mainstream European environmental history. What followed this transition was the Little Ice Age, conventionally dated from roughly 1300 to 1850, with its most severe phase generally placed between 1550 and 1700, a window that includes the Maunder Minimum, a documented multi-decade collapse in solar sunspot activity between 1645 and 1715, independently verified, not through any historian's narrative, but through beryllium and carbon isotope proxies preserved in ice cores. This is, again, uncontested mainstream science, not revisionist speculation. And notice, before we go any further, the precise historical window this catastrophic climate collapse occupies. It runs directly through the same 14th through 17th century period that Fomenko and Nosowski propose as the true era of their great horde empire, and that the online Tartaria research community independently identifies as the era of a lost, subsequently erased global civilization. Here is the honest, defensible synthesis this investigation offers, and it requires no invented conspiracy to state you do not need a fabricated chronology to explain widespread, catastrophic, architecturally destructive flooding across a specific climatic window in Northern Europe. That is documented, mainstream, uncontested climate history, on the record in the peer-reviewed literature, independent of anything Fomenko, Ewing, or this investigation has to say about it. The genuinely open, mystery-worthy question is narrower and considerably more interesting than, did the Middle Ages happen at all? It is this: how much of the buried ground floor architectural anomaly that mud flood researchers point to across Europe, partially submerged doorways, sunken ground levels in older buildings, structures whose original entrances now sit below the modern street, correlates specifically with the documented 13th and 14th century North Sea flood window and the subsequent centuries of Little Ice Age. Hydrological instability versus how much is fully explained by the mundane, separately and extensively documented phenomenon of urban ground level rise from centuries of accumulated debris and deliberate street raising, a pattern recorded in the municipal planning archives of London, Paris, and virtually every other major European city. That is a testable, narrower claim than either the total fabrication thesis or the total dismissal thesis offers, and it does not require discarding a single one of the independent astronomical anchors, the cuneiform eclipses, the Chinese dynastic records that fix the broader chronological skeleton in place. We take this exact question with us into episode 2. The verdict, the evidence actually supports. We have now walked through the full documentary record this episode set out to examine, and an honest investigation owes its audience a clear verdict, not the comfortable, lazy verdict of total dismissal that institutional history offers by default, and not the equally comfortable, equally lazy verdict of total fabrication that the most dramatic revisionist claims offer as an alternative. The evidence, weighed the way a jury is asked to weigh evidence, supports a specific, narrower, and ultimately more damning conclusion than either extreme. It is proven beyond reasonable dispute that Joseph Scaliger's chronology was elite-funded, patronage-shaped, and confessionally constrained, a construction assembled inside specific institutions for specific institutional purposes by a specific man operating under specific financial and political pressures. It is proven that this chronological framework served and continues to serve concrete, fiscal, legal, and military administrative functions for the states and institutions that adopted it. It is documented in the specific and consequential case of Annius of Viterbo's forged Berosus and forged Manetho that Renaissance elite institutions did commission and benefit from outright chronological forgery when it served their dynastic and confessional interests, establishing beyond any doubt that the capability, the motive, and the historical precedent for this kind of manipulation are real, proven, and not merely theoretical. It is also documented with equal force that the critical philological traditions Scaliger belonged to functioned in this specific and important case as the mechanism that exposed and destroyed that forgery, not as its author. What is not established, what remains, on the current public evidence, unproven, is the maximal claim that the entire pre-modern timeline is a single coordinated fabrication engineered by Renaissance bankers. That stronger claim would require successfully explaining away independent Assyrian eponym eclipses recovered from underground mounds 2.5 centuries after Scaliger's death, independent Babylonian astronomical diaries, independent Chinese dynastic astronomy that created genuine chronological headaches for the very Europeans supposedly fabricating the system, and 4 independently cross-validating physical clocks, tree rings, ice cores, lake valves, and calibrated radiocarbon, none of which required a Renaissance humanist's permission to record the passage of time. That evidentiary burden has not been met, and any honest jury, presented with the full record rather than a curated portion of it, would be obligated to say so. What the evidence does establish, and this is where this episode leaves its verdict, is this. The Scaligerian chronological order, the specific habit of reading every civilization on earth through one biblical classical spine, printed under monopoly privilege, taught under dynastic and confessional patronage, and deployed by fiscal military states to administer debt, taxation, and legal claims, was never a neutral discovery. It was, and remains, an elite knowledge technology. It standardized time in the specific service of extraction, debt enforcement, and institutional legitimacy. It hardened weak documentary joins into settled fact. It privileged the manuscripts that survived through convenient custodial channels over the ones that did not. And it systematically subordinated the Byzantine, Jewish, Islamic, Armenian, Ethiopian, Persian, Chinese, and Mesoamerican calendrical systems that had, and in several cases still have, equally valid claims to describing the same passage of centuries, treating those competing systems as merely local curiosities while treating the Christian European system with no more independent justification than any of its rivals as universal fact. That is the honest verdict this episode returns. Not history is a lie. Not the textbooks are entirely correct and above suspicion. Something narrower, and for that very reason, something far more difficult for any institution to comfortably dismiss. The past is not a fact we discovered. It is a model we built, funded by specific people with specific interests, and we have spent 4 centuries mistaking the model's authority for the authority of nature itself. Robert Newton's unexplained lunar anomaly is real and remains without a fully satisfying mainstream explanation. Anatoly Fomenko's statistical dynasty matching methodology is real, mathematically serious, and has never been refuted with comparable mathematical rigor, only dismissed with institutional confidence. And the documented Renaissance forgery of Annius of Viterbo proves, beyond any argument, that the capability and the motive for large-scale chronological manipulation were not merely available to the men who built our calendar. They were, in at least one fully documented case, used. Where this leaves us, as we close episode 1 and prepare to walk into the physical evidence, the star forts, the vanished power infrastructure disguised as places of worship, and the catastrophic flooding that may explain far more of the missing architectural record than any invented century ever could, is precisely where a genuine forensic investigation should leave its audience at the end of its first act. Convinced that something is deeply wrong with the official story, uncertain exactly how much of it is wrong, and equipped for the first time with the specific named evidence required to keep asking better questions instead of settling for either comfortable answer. The clock was built. We have shown you the builder, the financiers, and the proven forgery. In episode 2, we go looking for the machinery the clock was built to hide. End of episode 1. Continue to episode 2. Tartaria and the Great Horde Ewing's Evidence, Star Forts, and the Little Ice Age Cataclysm. This presentation was produced by Creatic Media, a veteran-owned digital studio. We build production-grade progressive web apps and custom software. Our own trivia platform, Muse Ion Trivia, shows exactly what we can deliver for your business. We also offer fully built business websites and ready-to-launch templates, from done-for-you sites to affordable starter designs. We also create marketing commercials using localized on-premise AI, giving small businesses broadcast quality ads for a fraction of the cost of a full marketing team. And because everything runs on our own hardware, your project never touches a remote data center. Your data stays private. Visit creaticmedia.com to start your project today. That concludes episode 1 of Renaissance Reinvention. Stay tuned for episode 2, where our investigation continues into Tartaria and the Great Horde. We will see you there.